Welcome to the Sens Spotlight podcast brought to you by the Sick Podcast Network. Today, we are so lucky to be joined by my colleague at Sportsnet, Luke Fox, who covers the Leafs. We're going to have some fun, kind of a little bit of banter back and forth, and just talk about the rivalry, how the two teams match up this season, and just kind of preview the season, but also those two teams, and maybe revisit a little bit of the Battle of Ontario. So, before we get started, we will shout out our sponsor. Go all the way with Betway and get a free bet up to $200 if your first bet loses. Scan the QR code on the screen or click on the link in the details section to create an account and redeem your welcome offer. Offer is only available for new customers. Terms and conditions apply. Offer available in Ontario. Must be 18 plus. Please play responsibly. Hit it, Jimmy.
Turn up your volume. Because you're about to listen to The Sick Podcast. Sens Spotlight.
Here's Alfredson, burst of speed, gets a shot away, score! Daniel Alfredson ends the game in overtime and sends the Ottawa Senators to the Stanley Cup Final for the first time in franchise history.
The sickest Ottawa Senators podcast. It's gonna be sick.
And we are going to bring on Luke Fox of Sportsnet, my colleague, the guy that I saw a lot in April of last year when the Sens and Leafs, battled it out in the playoffs. Luke, thanks so much for taking the time and doing this. How was your summer, and how much did you miss the Battle of Ontario during the summer and covering that series?
Didn't miss it at all. I didn't miss covering this, but that has nothing to do with the Leafs or the Sens. I didn't miss the Stanley Cup final. I didn't miss going to rinks and taking my kid to practice. I just enjoyed my summer. The hockey season is long, Alex. So getting a break from it is extremely necessary. So enjoyed some golf and some beach time, family road trip. Catching up with my non-hockey friends. It was good, but I was just at the Leafs golf tournament today, and it felt like summer went by in a blink. It felt like I didn't miss a day of work. It felt right back to action. So here we go, training camp week. Do it all again.
Before we get to kind of the Sens and the Leafs, but maybe just for you, is it a bit different just without the Mitch Marner? It felt like that storyline was brewing for so long. Does it feel a bit calmer in Leafland? Maybe Sens fans don't like that because I think they like the turmoil of the Leafs, which it felt like was a bit of a circus the past couple of years. But does it feel a bit more kind of subdued in Leafsland?
Well, Sens fans called it, right? Marner's leaving. That's what they were chanting, and they were dead right. It feels different for the first time in a long time. 9 years of the Matthews, Marner, Nylander core, and that's finally over with. I think Leaf fans, most of them, and the feeling around the Leafs players, it just feels a little bit different. And maybe that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be better or worse. I still think they're a good team, but it feels different. And I think feeling different is enough for now, because there was a lot of sameness, a lot of the same old question. Can the core four get it done? Or why did they keep them together? Well, now there finally is some measure of change. So it does feel different. And it feels like this is more in line with what Brad Treliving and with what Craig Berube want in a hockey team. And that is a more balanced lineup. Now, there's going to be serious questions. Like, they lost their top scorer, guy that plays top line 5-on-5, top PK, top PP. You remove him, there's a lot of holes to fill, not just one. And they have a lot to prove. But I think if you're in that dressing room, you're like, all of a sudden, all these minutes have been freed up. All this opportunity is there. And it's a chance to kind of, write a new chapter, a little bit of a clean slate.
From my vantage point, like looking at the two teams and kind of matching them up, I feel the Senators right now have a bit of that same feeling to what the Leafs were maybe in 2018, 2019. Obviously, at that time, Marner, Matthews were much younger than maybe Tim Stützle and Brady Tkachuk, but I feel the Senators are kind of in this window where it feels like, the playoffs, they've jumped in, they finally made it. But now it's like, hey, let's make some noise. Let's do something in it. And it feels like the Leafs are, as you mentioned, Marner leaves. It probably is going to be much calmer in Leafland. But Mitch Marner, as for all of his playoff warts in the playoffs, obviously struggled. But this team, you can't make up Mitch Marner with as good as Nick Waugh, Michelli is. Maybe Easton Cowan jumps up. Like, do you think like the Sens have maybe surpassed the Leafs in terms of how good they'll be this season? Because that's something that I'm really curious about. Where I don't think the Sens are, you know, leaps and bounds better than the Leafs, but I do think that the playoff series last year, the Sens maybe have a bit more experience. They might not lose the first 2 or 3 games. It's a bit tighter. We have a game 7 in Toronto. We know how that goes. Like heading into this season, how do you feel like the two teams match up?
Yeah, I think the gap has narrowed, and I think one team has momentum where another team has experience. And you know, uh, but on paper, and that's all we can gauge it by right now. The puck hasn't dropped yet. I still think the Leafs goaltending is better in terms of the tandem they have with Anthony Stolars, who's coming into a contract year, big year for him, and Joseph Woll. Health is always going to be an issue with those guys, but in terms of a proven one-two punch, I still would probably take them over Allmark. And that's due respect to him, but I think he got outplayed a little bit in that series. So I'm not ready to give goaltending to Ottawa just yet. And I think defense, I would probably say Jake Sanderson might be the best defenseman in Ontario, but 1 through 6, 1 through 7, I might take the Leafs decor. So I still might give the edge to the Leafs, but the Sens are certainly gaining ground, and what they have on their side is youth. I feel like their core is coming into their prime, whereas Toronto, especially on the back end, is getting a little bit older.
Yeah.
It's going to be hard to say that Morgan Riley is going to bust out and have a career year, or Chris Tanev is going to be any better than he was last year. He was phenomenal. Like these guys may have already peaked, a lot of them. Oliver Ekman-Larsson's probably not getting much better, right? Whereas, I feel like that gap, and a lot of it's just due to age and window of contention, is going to keep shrinking, and eventually the Sens are going to pass them. But right now, I still have the Leafs ahead.
I think the point that you mentioned about the defense, I think is a really interesting, almost meta question that you can ask about, hockey as a whole is if you have depth versus the one-star defenseman, especially on the back end. Like I think Jake Sanderson, the way he played in the playoffs was, in my opinion, I mean, you were at the games too and covering, but I thought he was the best defenseman in the series by a high bar. I think Chris Tana played really well, Jake McCabe
Yeah.
as well, but they weren't at that level, I would say. And Morgan Riley's taken a bit of a step, well, a considerable step down the past couple of years. But I do think you're right that the Leafs have a much more deep decor. But when you have the best defenseman on the ice for 30 minutes a game, like the balance of powers and the ice tilts towards the Senators. And as you mentioned, they're only getting older.
Mhm.
Morgan Riley seems to be really taking a step back, even though he's not that old. He's still pretty, I think in his early 30s. But I think you look at Thomas Chabot, he's younger than you think, although he's been in the league forever, right? He's only 28. I really like the Sens decor as a whole, but I think you're right that the Leafs are a bit deeper. But I think this year, like if Jake Sanderson is top 5, 6 in Norris Trophy voting. Like, I don't know why the Senators don't have a deeper decor. I think you're right about the goaltending, but I don't know if like Stolars and Woll both have injury history. So does Linus Allmark. So it's almost
Yeah.
a little bit of a wash. And Levy Marilainen is an unproven guy. So I think for me, you look at the forward group, and again, it's interesting. Like the more I talk about these two teams, they feel very, very even, which is how they basically played, matched up against each other in the playoffs.
Yeah, for sure. And I guess one thing we didn't talk about was coaching. And I think Berube is just a little bit more experienced and a little more accomplished than Travis Green. I think he has fantastic control over the Leafs room. I think they've really bought into his style of play. So I am curious to see what a second year under him, where most of the core kind of knows what to expect and they're not trying to figure him out or adjust. I wonder if that's going to help the Leafs. The fact that he already has 1 year under his belt. So that's another thing that could help the Leafs. You brought up Morgan Rielly, and I think he's going to be a really central figure to the Leafs. He started taking some heat from the fan base last season, but I was just talking to Nick Waugh at the golf tournament, and this is his first time going through the captain's skates in Toronto. Been with Vegas, won a ring there. And he was asked, like in those captain skates, who's popped to you? Like who's looked really good that maybe you didn't think? And he said, Morgan Rielly. That was his first name out of his mouth. He said, this guy's been buzzing. Like he's been killing it. And we haven't been allowed in, us as reporters, to the pre-camp skates. So we won't get our first look until Thursday. But I just wonder if, Rielly's a pretty smart guy. He understands the market. I wonder if he felt, a little of the heat. And, there was talk of, hey, maybe they should go to him and ask him to waive his no move because he has full no move. And he was even asked that at locker cleanout. Would you consider waiving your no move? And, these guys are competitive. You get asked a question like that, you might go into the summer and say, I'm going to stick it to these doubters, people who think I'm done. So that's not saying he's going to, but I think, he's going to be a really big focal point. And the other thing is, towards the end or basically the whole second half of the Leafs season, he was taken off the top power play unit and replaced by Marner as the quarterback. Now Marner's gone. Who's going to run point? Probably Morgan Rielly again. So he might get that taste of PP1. And he knows that his grip on that job is pretty tenuous. So, do we see him have a bit of a bounce back? I'm not saying he's going to score 20 goals again like he did at his peak, but does Rielly have a bounce back? I think he will be very motivated.
The interesting thing, like covering this Leafs team for, all the playoff, escapades into the losses of, in game sevens and just all the different ways the Leafs would lose. And it felt a lot like Mitch Marner got a lot of the blame for it. And I don't think Morgan Rielly as a whole deserves like a ton of heat. He actually played really well in the playoffs, but I look back at those iterations of Leafs teams and they never, like as good as Morgan Rielly was, he was never really one of the top 5-10 defensemen. Like maybe at one point, maybe you could say like 10-9, but I think that's the thing when I look at the Sens roster is I think Tim Stützle can be one of the best centers in the league. I don't think he'll ever be as good as Austin Matthews, and that's a high bar, and that's what the Leafs have, and that's what the Senators don't. But I think he can get pretty close to him. I don't think he's ever scoring 60, 70 goals, but I think he can be a 100-point guy pretty consistently in the next 5 or so years. You have Brady Tkachuk, who's he doesn't play like William Nylander, but he kind of has the swag and charisma like William Nylander in different ways. But I just see the next 5 years, like this Senators team, I think is only going to keep improving. And I look at the Leafs, and unless Austin Matthews returns to a 60-goal guy, which he can do, you kind of think, as you said, like their best years and the best windows is behind this Leafs team. And I just think if you had to put money on who is going to go deeper in the playoffs the next 5 years, who can maybe win a cup, I would put a lot of money on the Senators, not because I think the Leafs are bad necessarily, but just because they're young, they're hungry. They don't have any playoff scars as much as last year's loss haunted them. It was, the first year in the playoffs. I think if they were to lose to the Leafs this year in the playoffs, we probably have a different story. But I just really like this Senators team. I am around them all the time. Maybe, Luke, you can teach me about, drinking the Kool-Aid in September after a promising season. I think I'm drinking like a little bit too much, but I do feel like
you're drinking a little.
A little bit. I am. But I also look at the analytics. I kind of believe in it, but we'll see. I don't think they're a cup contender by no means, but I don't feel like the Leafs are either. So maybe put me in my place.
No. I don't have either as that top tier cup contender right now. We'll reevaluate after the trade deadline. Like the Leafs wanted a top 6 forward. They never got one. Like they were all over Brad Marchand. And had he gone to market, my understanding is he would probably be a Maple Leaf. Of course, he didn't. He ended up staying with their bitter rival, their nemesis, the team they can't get past, the Florida Panthers. And maybe in the long run, that's for the best. Like, that is a juicy, juicy contract for a guy who's, nearing the end of his career, probably. But what the Leafs are trying to do is build a third line. They felt like they got crushed, just absolutely murdered by the Lundell, Luosterainen, Marchand third line in that Florida series. And Brad Treliving believes that, Barkov and Matthews, it was almost a saw-off. Matthews, you need him to score more. That, I think everyone understands that. That's obvious. But that's hard to do against Barkov, who shuts down a lot of the top guys. But if the top guys are a saw-off or close to it, you need more from your bottom six. And the Leafs had nothing. They had no support scoring. They can't score when it matters. So, going out and getting Dakota Joshua, the bet here is that we're going to have a real third line and not just throw who's ever left over who can't fit into our top six into a third line, and actually have an identity there. If the Leafs are to have success, I think they're going to have to make a trade for a top six forward midseason, and guys are going to have career years. Max Domi has to bounce back. Morgan Rielly has to bounce back. The goalies have to stay healthy. There's a lot of things that have to go right. And part of the reason why they have to go right is because the Senators are coming, because the Canadians are coming. Tampa isn't, going away. Florida is, all they're talking about is three-peat already. So maybe you could make an argument for the Central. I'll hear that. But outside of that, I think the Atlantic is just going to be the most competitive division. I think it's going to be really fierce because who's tanking? Buffalo and Detroit, but not on purpose. It's just they just don't have.
They're not good.
They don't have enough talent, in my opinion.
Yeah. It's interesting. You're talking about the Leafs depth, and we watched that series last year, and Shane Pinto, Ridley Gregg, and Michael Amadio were up against the Matthews, Marner, Nyes line the whole series, and they did really well, all things considered. And I was just preparing for this recording and for this podcast and looking at how well Dakota Joshua did last year. And obviously he had cancer, but had a down year, but fair circumstances. You look at Nick Waugh in Vegas, McMahon as well, who was pretty absent in the playoffs, and
no goals. No goals in either series.
No. And I'm Ridley Gregg, I think he kind of did a bit better at the end of the year, and we'll talk about Gregg probably at a later point in this podcast, but he had more points.
You got the bobblehead yet? You got the
no. That's I need to get Ian Mendez, the PR guy, to send it early just to have it on my counter for the podcast or something, just on display. But he had more points than Nick Waugh last year. As much as the Leafs brought in depth players, and I think they're a deeper team, as you alluded to, it's the Sens, I think, have one of the deepest forward groups in the league, right? You have Michael Amadio potentially on your fourth line, who has scored 15, 16 goals the past couple of years in the NHL. Lars Eller, Ridley Gregg, Shane Pinto had 20 goals as a third line center. They're a really deep team. I think what they are still missing is the exact same thing the Leafs are missing. They need another top six impactful winger in their case, right? Like the Leafs. So I feel like both teams are in a similar scenario where, obviously for different reasons, obviously Marner left in the offseason, but for the Senators, they're missing probably one 50, 60, 70 point high impact winger to kind of put them into maybe not a cup contender, but you're starting to get close to that. But it's interesting that it feels like the teams are in the same place, but for very different reasons, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And the one thing I would say is that I don't know if and this is all due respect to Timmy Stützle, but I think Austin Matthews and William Nylander are more established as game breakers. And they can win a game for you. They have a longer track record of doing so. Part of that's just age, but and they're still in their prime. The Leafs' two best players are still in their prime, and that's a big deal. The other thing is Matthews has something to prove this year. He really does. And talk behind the scenes is he was even more hurt than a lot of us knew. I was told that, there were some games his back was so bad he had trouble tying up his skates, but he still
Wow.
went out there and performed. I mean, following the team, it was evident that he was battling something because he skipped some morning skates and some practices completely due to quote unquote maintenance. But you don't do that if you're feeling good. So he didn't complain a lot, but I think just watching him or even listening to his tone in interviews that he was hampered. And by all
Mm.
reports, and I mean, everyone can feel great in the summer. We're going to have to see when he actually gets into the battle drills of camp, but he should be closer to the guy, getting 60
Almost hits.
goals than the guy struggling to reach 40 goals. And so
Yeah.
that's huge right there. Like when you talk about how do you make up Marner's 102 points, some of those aren't coming from Waugh and Joshua and Michelli. They're coming from Matthews.
But the interesting thing on the Sens side is, and you talked about Craig Berube implementing a system in Toronto, and to see how the Leafs kind of handle him, the second year, how much more comfortable, maybe a bit more free flowing. It's kind of the same thing in Ottawa where Travis Green came in and he's like, we're doing is defense. Like he literally said in training camp, we only focused on defense until basically at the beginning of the season we started implementing offensive game plans and systems. And you look at Tim Stützle, Brady Tkachuk, like they weren't lighting the world on fire offensively, and the team struggled to generate at 5-on-5. And Travis Green has already spoken about how he's trying to maybe open things up to some degree so that they generate some offense. So for me, it's like if they can have those defensive principles that were just not existent for so long, but prior to last season, they have those instilled, and now they start to score a little bit more. I feel like they're in a really good position than maybe like last year, where it really felt like it was hard for them to score. And I wonder how much of that was just inexperience, and compared to the system and playing very stout defensively. But I wonder if we maybe see Tim Stützle unleashed a little bit more. And I was even like looking at the point totals, like he was only 4 or 5 points below Nylander last year, and playing a lot of defensive zone scenarios rather than Nylander, of course, who's much more of a one-way type of player and obviously not a center as well. So I feel like Brady Tkachuk and Tim Stützle are going to have big offensive years as they get, as you mentioned, closer to their primes, but also maybe have unleashed a little bit more in the offensive zone. So I feel pretty optimistic that maybe the Leafs will get more goals from Matthews, which I think is a good bet considering he's scored a lot of goals in the NHL, especially when he's healthy. But I also feel the same way that Tim Stützle, Brady Tkachuk, who had a down year, battled a ton of injuries as well, is gonna take the next step as well.
Yeah, no, I wouldn't be surprised at all. So how would you rank the Atlantic standings if you had to pick right now?
I was gonna
give me the
you're taking
top
my
4.
job. Okay, I'll put it in order. So I don't know if this will come out by the time my story drops for Sportsnet. But my bold prediction was that the Senators will win the Atlantic Division regular season crown. I don't think they're going to make it to the third round. And this is my rationale.
You're just pandering to your own readers. Okay.
Well, it's a bold prediction. I didn't say, hey, I wholeheartedly believe it, but I have to make a bold prediction, so I'm going to make one. I'd rather miss, but I think my rationale is decently strong. Is that I think Florida in the regular season, they're just not going to carry. I mean, you've been around that team so much. The Sens were 2 points behind them, I want to say, in the standings last year. So if the Sens are a bit better in the regular season, which I think they will with Jordan Spence coming in, I think just the difference between Jordan Spence to Travis Hamonic is a pretty huge kind of increase in talent and just wins above replacement. I think they're a year older. They've learned how to win. They had this really poor start at the end of the year. So I think if they're just not terrible to begin the season, and maybe they will be, maybe it's always in November where like the Sens suck and they're 3 games below 500. But I think if they have a better start, Hallmarks doesn't even need to be too healthy. I believe in Levi Merlainen. I think all those guys, Tkachuk, Stützle, a year older, a year better, better understanding of how to win in NHL. And then you look, Florida takes a step back. I don't think the Leafs, and maybe you feel differently, and we'll ask you, I don't think the Leafs will be as good a regular season team without Marner. I think Tampa's still pretty old. Like, I don't know if they'll get better next year. And then I like the Habs, but I don't know if they'll be that much better without a second line center. So I think it's a pretty wide open Atlantic division. And I feel like the Sens are in the best position to, they don't need to do too much out of the ordinary to be a better team. Like, they don't need career years from all these players to take a huge step. While I feel like the Leafs, they need Michelli to hit, they need Max Domi to hit, they need Morgan Rielly to have a breakout season, which I feel like the Sens, it's a bit more inertia. So that's my reasoning. I don't think they're gonna go make it to the third round in the playoffs. I don't feel they're at that point yet, unless they make some massive trade. But that's my reasoning why the Sens will come first. I'll put Florida second. I'll put the Leafs third. I'll put Tampa fourth. That'll be my order. Okay. So how about you, Luke?
I want you to send that to John Cooper. Let's see what he's. No, you build a good case, and I feel like Tampa has a little bit of what Florida has in terms of not really caring about the regular season crown so much, and I actually think it would be healthy for the division if it's Ottawa or even if Montreal takes a big step, like someone new. Like it was just interesting last year seeing Boston fall off because they and the Leafs were tied going into the year with eight-year active runs of making the playoffs, which is cool, but it also kind of gets boring, like the same superpowers in the Atlantic. So it was refreshing to see Ottawa and Montreal make the dance. I could totally see that happening. I could totally see the Senators taking a step. I still think I would still put them fourth and just say it's not quite their time, but I could be totally wrong because I agree that it's going to be very tight.
Do you think? I was just going to say, do you think the Leafs will finish ahead of the Sens in the standings?
Yes, but I say that not confidently.
Yeah.
I think they will be, a couple wins short without Marner.
Yeah. See, that's kind of what I'm building into it, right? Is that all the Atlantic teams are either older, don't care about the regular season, or lost Mitch Marner. Right? And the Sens don't have that issue. The Sens are younger. So I'm curious what your take is, and obviously you're not a fan of the Leafs, but what do you make of the Michael Andlauer with the Ridley Gregg bobblehead day? Like, what do you think of that from maybe not a Leafs perspective as a fan, but like in that world more so? Like, what do you think of that?
Yeah, I'm not a Leafs fan, but a lot of my friends are Leaf fans just by nature of geography and where I live. And I got multiple messages about that bobblehead night, pointing out that the other team in Ontario is celebrating an empty net goal from a couple seasons ago, and the fact that if you're going to do it, why aren't you doing it on a night the Leafs are in town? Like, I think the bobblehead night is against the Panthers. It's like, if you're going to go full troll, do it when the Toronto fans are right there. Really rub it in. Like, if that's your game plan. But I got a kick out of during that playoff round, how fans would hold up printed out copies, still shots of the Greg empty netter, and get that on the jumbotron. And so I like it. I really loved how the Sens were full into the chants, full into bringing that up, like really leaning into what edges they do have over Toronto. But the Toronto fans can always just point to the head-to-head playoff record, right?
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, not to diminish the head-to-head playoff record, but I basically don't remember, not to make anyone who's listening to this feel old, but I don't really recall the Battle of Ontario's in the early 2000s. So it's interesting. I think for Sens fans, the one of my generation, like the younger ones, I don't think losing to Toronto had the same kind of demons of the past in terms of, oh my God, here we go again. We always lose to Toronto. I also think the context of the team finally bursting into the playoffs after not making it for so long. But I do think, like I was speaking out loud earlier in this podcast, if they play Toronto again in the playoffs and Ottawa loses, then you start thinking, oh, there's something there. But that also brings me to, like, how much fun would it be to do a sequel? I don't know if that changes for you, Luke, because you've done so many. Okay, here we go. It's Toronto Boston for the eighth time in a row, or Toronto. But I do think the rivalry between these two teams is going to ratchet up, and I think the Ridley Gregg bobblehead is such a great thing. I think you're right that it should be against the Leafs. That's the
Yeah.
one thing where I'd say, hey, come on, like go all in. But maybe if the Leafs, have some crazy event in a game this season, or if they play each other in the playoffs, like, and they had a similar type of Ridley Gregg bobblehead night when they played the Sens or the Panthers or whoever, I'd like that. I like when teams kind of go out of their way and kind of heighten some of the friendly rivalry up between teams.
Yeah, and Marner aside, we're both these teams are nearly identical, right? Like there wasn't a ton of turnover, a little bit, but not a ton. So I think that playoff series only ratcheted up the rivalry. I think some real hate got brewed there, whether it was Greg versus Stolars, or whether it was the pettiness of people complaining about the warm up stuff. Like
Oh yeah.
there was a lot going on there. Those teams do not like each other. So yeah, I wouldn't be tired of it.
No.
A rematch, whether it's in round 1 or round 2, I don't think it would be a bad thing. I think there's still meat on the bone there, and I think actually because these guys already went to war against each other once, it would only be that much more intense if we were as observers lucky enough to get a round 2.
How do you think the dynamic between the fan bases will maybe change if the Sens start becoming the little brother that, is maybe not beating up on the bigger brother, but starts, winning in the playoffs or going deeper? Like, how do you think that'll kind of change the dynamic between the two teams on the ice and off the ice as well?
Yeah, I don't know, what the fans say have an impact on the ice, but I just think the city of Ottawa can puff its chest out a little bit more. I think I was kind of blown away, going into that series. I thought Leaf fans would make the commute and take over the Canadian Tire Center, and that didn't happen at all. It was
No.
the Sens fans were louder in Ottawa than the Leafs fans were in Toronto. That
Yeah.
was the better atmosphere. And that wasn't because of an enemy invasion. That was because the Sens fans were loud and proud, and they showed up and uh, had fun. And,
Yeah.
you can do that when you're the underdog, right?
Yeah.
You could do that a little bit more when you're the underdog. I'm curious to see how the team performs and how the fans react now that there's a little bit more expectations, right? And
Hmm.
if they do what you're talking about and finish ahead of the Leafs in the standings, and are the team with some buzz, then maybe they're not the underdog. So I think a lot of it has to do with the framing of the two teams as they go in to meet in a playoff round.
Yeah, the one thing, and I've thought about this a little bit just being around the players, and I mean, I've only really been around the Senators in my career in terms of like a team day to day, but you look at their best players and they have that, like, I mean, every hockey player works their butt off, but like just utter competitiveness. Like if you looked at Tim Stützle, Jake Sanderson, and I thought they played really well in the playoffs, all things considered, despite it was their first. Like it didn't feel like the moment was too big for them. Maybe they
Game
could
one
bring
was
back.
too big for them. I would argue.
That's
I would
yeah,
argue.
but I felt
They
like the
seemed
whole
out of
team.
overwhelmed. The team as a whole seemed overwhelmed in game one, I think.
Yeah, and outside of that game, I felt like they passed with flying colors, which gives me like optimism. But I think you're right for the Senators team this year. They finally do have the expectations of, hey, you're supposed to make the playoffs. You're supposed to not just lose in the playoffs. You're supposed to, hopefully win a round like that. If they come back and they lose in 5 against the Leafs or Florida, it's not going to be a successful season, right? And there's going to start like the winds will start to turn a little bit, and there's going to be the Kachuk thing and everything as he gets closer to the end of his deal. So it's going to be a really interesting year, I think, for both teams. And I just hope that I see you in April again, mostly because it was a lot of fun to work beside you and alongside you, covering that playoff series. But Luke, before I let you go, thanks so much for taking the time and doing this. Is there anything at Sportsnet? I know this is a Sens podcast, but is there anything kind of lined up that you want to maybe promote or share before I let you go? How was Allmark in Vegas? I don't know if you.
He was good. He's one of the more fascinating characters in the league, and I really like him because he's always himself. You always feel like you're dealing with a guy who's not afraid to speak what's on his mind, and he's just a little bit different, like a lot of goalies. So I appreciate that he's comfortable being himself. I always get a kick out of him. I wrote a little bit about this, but we touched on the goaltending. But one of the big things with Linus is he's not on the team. If they're making the Team Sweden Olympic team today, he's probably not on it, or he's a spare. So he has a lot to prove. So if you're a Sens fan, that's great news, because he should be fit. He should be dialed in, because he's not only playing to return to the playoffs, but he's playing to get on the national team. And that is huge, especially, I was going to say especially for Europeans, but it's just as huge for Canadians and Americans. Like, getting on your national team and playing in the Olympics is something these guys dream about. And he had it, right? He was top 2 going into the Four Nations, and he slipped a little bit in the favor of Swedish management. So he has a ton to prove, and that's good news for Sens fans.
Yeah, and not even getting invited to the World Championships, like after, and he wanted to go. Like, you rarely see something like that. And I don't know enough. I've read the tea leaves, but I wouldn't say I have any hard reporting. But that's an interesting storyline heading into the year. And I do think, like, as a whole, he was outplayed by Anthony Stolarz in the first round. I don't think by that much, but I think Stolarz, especially in the first 3 games that the Leafs, jumped out to the series lead, Stolarz was by far the better goalie, making the big saves in the big moments, unlike Allmark. And that probably was the difference in the end, right? So, and Allmark has the history of, he hasn't really played well in the playoffs. So it's going to be interesting to see how he plays. I think, and we won't get to it too much, everything I see here, read about Levi Merilainen, I feel pretty confident that he could be. I think there might be, a goalie battle down. Maybe it's not this year, but in the next 2-3 years, where maybe he surpasses Allmark, especially if he doesn't rise to the occasion because of the Olympics or whatever. But Luke, thanks so much for taking the time doing this kind of quirky little podcast where we do a bit of Sens Leafs. So I appreciate you taking the time and doing this, and hopefully we can do this in a couple months from now, when maybe these 2 teams square off in the playoffs.
Yeah, it just won't be on bobblehead night. We know that.
Bring it back for the playoffs. That's what we used to do. Awesome.
Right, thanks,
Luke.
Thanks.
And that's a wrap. Hope you don't miss us too much until next time. Follow the Sick Podcast Sens Spotlight on YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, Google Play, and Apple Podcasts.